You're listening to the Rifcord podcast.
So in terms of the implications moving forward for higher education as a result of this pandemic, I'd be happy to talk to your audience about that. I'm somebody who, even before this crisis emerged, would have predicted, or would have. I'm not a betting man, but I would have predicted or forecasted that the university system, or the post-secondary sector in North America, was due for a correction. I believed that there was a bubble in higher education, too many students, too many programs, maybe even too many universities in terms of brick and mortar institutions. And I foresaw that a lot of these institutions would have problems going forward with student admissions and enrollments, because I believe that online competitors who could be more nimble, who could be more flexible, and most importantly for students, cost effective, as we've seen the price of higher education, explode in the past couple of decades. I thought that you would see, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, a move away from the traditional brick and mortar university into more of a flexible online system. And that this would largely be driven by students and by consumers, because they weren't getting the satisfactory product that they were searching for, especially for the cost of a modern university education. And this whole forcing everything online when it comes to university education, we've been scrambling over the past couple of weeks to convert our in-person classes to online courses with varying degrees of success, I think this is just going to expedite that process of more people being open to online education, more people, both in terms of students, but also professors and people at the university being more flexible and open to these kinds of instructions. And this may indeed quicken what I thought was a future trend in terms of more students moving online and away from the traditional brick and mortar university. So that's kind of where I see things happening right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of things are being forced to speed up and go online. My wife works in healthcare, and she always comments that OHIP has now put in a billing code, which means your doctors can do FaceTime or phone consultations, and they can be paid for that. It's considered a regular doctor's visit. And her comment was, if we didn't have this crisis, that would have taken years to negotiate that.
Yeah.
Now, with just the necessity of it, it's in place. You can now consult with your doctor on the telephone, and that's considered a visit for billing purposes.
Yeah, and I would say that's very positive. And one of the, everyone's, I think, searching for silver linings during this crisis. One of them would be, we've seen how easy and effective it can be to roll back red tape, roll back regulations in order to get something done. And I hope that educates people about the sort of unnecessary or arbitrary nature of a lot of these regulations and rules, that if it's okay in an emergency and it seems to work in a positive direction, and we don't see the negative consequences or externalities that are the justified reasons for why we have these regulations in the first place, maybe we'll begin to consider just how much red tape and regulation that there is in our society and economy that is holding us back in many ways. And I think you're seeing this crucially and importantly in the healthcare sector, which is one of the most regulated sectors, certainly in the Canadian economy, but also in the American economy. And you're seeing this in terms of shortages for personal protective equipment, for ventilators, for beds. We don't have the capacity, first of all, because of the regulations put in place on production, but we also don't have the capacity in an emergency to ramp up production because of the cost to entry, compliance with regulations. So people haven't set up industries to be able to convert, to be able to, on a dime, pivot, because the compliance costs are so great just to start up a business in one sector, let alone to transition effectively into another. And you are seeing, rules and regulations being ripped down as fast as possible in order to facilitate the expansion of production that we need in these vital areas. And it just makes you kind of scratch your head as to why we had this stuff in the first place if it's so crucial and important now.
Yeah, that's true. And this morning we just spoke with my little girl's teacher. Same thing. They're moving all the classes online. It's actually far from a smooth transition.
Yes.
And I recently saw an interview with Tony Clement recounting what he went through with SARS, and he used an expression that I love, which is we were building the airplane as we were flying it, which paints quite a picture of, you know, trying to hold it together in this precarious. And that's what we're doing with our school is we're building the airplane as we're flying it. Every day we're gonna modify and change and see what works.
Mm-hmm. And I think
the school you're going.
I think that can be positive too. The problem is when we're all on the same plane together and nobody can try a different solution, right? If we're all forced on the same airplane and there's one group of people that's telling us, well, this is how we have to build it, but nobody knows how it's supposed to be built, I think you can see the problem of that one size fits all solution. So the idea of a smooth transition, or the idea that things can be done in an easy manner, I don't think any of this is going to be done in an easy manner, but the more places where people can experiment and the more control people can have over, you know, their local or direct environments and contexts, that's going to give us the ability to see what works and what doesn't work in a far more robust fashion than if we're all trying the same thing at once. And, you know, if that solution is the wrong solution, well, then we're all going down with the plane.
No, exactly. Exactly.
And it's sort of a broader argument for decentralization of authority and of decision making, which I just believe is more generally effective as opposed to centralized control and decision making.
Right, of course. Yeah. Now, just to rewind a little bit, when you talked about the future of the universities,
yes,
that question and that discussion about whether should young people go to universities, like I grew sick of that conversation a long time ago. During my 20s, like we talked about it constantly, and I exhausted it. Like I had heard enough. I knew all the arguments for and against. For myself, you know, I didn't love university, but I'm so glad that I went and was successful, because I think for me personally, it would have been a shame to go my whole life wondering, well, maybe what would happen if I had done it. And I did it, right? And would I have been successful? And the answer is yes. But yeah, so and it's interesting to me that 30 years later we're still having that discussion, and the universities are still signing people up
at record numbers.
At record numbers. My best friend has just been appointed a college president in Ontario, and he says they still have trouble getting high school students to apply. The upside for him is a lot of BA graduates end up going to college. So his line is, we're going to get you eventually. Yeah. You may not agree to apply today, but in 4 years you'll be back. Yeah,
and you know, think about the costs of that, right? Because you're likely talking about someone who went to university, and no, this is a generalization, but you're talking about someone who likely went to university, did their 4-year degree, probably got into debt, and then realized that they didn't have the bargaining power on the market to be able to get a job that would effectively allow them to pay off their debt. So now they've probably backtracked into the college system because they need that sort of they need that credential to be able to get a reasonably well-paying job that's going to justify the sunk cost they've already put into education. And it just think about the tragedy of that. Some of these people have wasted 4 years of their lives. So that could have been years training. It could have been years learning on the job and earning money. So you've got more people with skills working in the economy, not going into debt. And so all of the negatives that come with university for some people, and it's increasingly more and more people with, you know, leaving university with debt and without proper career opportunities that will allow you to pay off this debt. And so you can understand why you get angry groups of students who protest and want things like their debt canceled, because they've been sold a bill of goods by a lot of people. And just imagine how many of those kids would have benefited from not going to university, getting into a 2-year college program, learning skills, getting experience, and earning money, as opposed to going into debt and then realizing, oh, well, I still probably have to go to college.
Right. Yeah. But it takes a lot of wisdom and experience to get to that view. And it's hard to, I don't know. I think about it with my daughter. It's when the day of the race comes as to what she's going to do. I still kind of think university is going to be a real option because it's a great, it's a great transition between your home life and your working life, right? And the musical chairs thing. I don't want her to be the one stuck without a degree when the music stops.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand that, and it's that's the kind of calculation, that parents are making, and young adults are making, but increasingly, I think the credential has become less valuable yet more expensive, and for a lot of people, that is an equation that they simply can't afford. And I do think that there is a place for the traditional university, for the brick and mortar institution, and for non-career producing disciplines. I myself went into history, which many people, that's one of the the hallmark degrees of what can you possibly do with that that's of any value.
Right.
So I understand. I understand, and I don't think you want to turn university into a large vocational college either, where you start to tie degrees to economic outcomes. I don't think that's a very good model for a university either. I would just rather see a greater variety of options, especially in our province of Ontario, where higher education is being steamrolled into a one-size-fits-all model, especially at the university level. Where I teach at Wilfrid Laurier, the transition has been incredible. This used to be Canada's top-ranked undergraduate-focused university, which means it didn't have a graduate program, but it focused extensively on providing an excellent undergraduate experience. But when government funding models dictate a lot of how the university funds itself, and the government essentially pushes all of its resources into research and development, well then universities like Wilfrid Laurier, in order to chase the dollars, institute graduate programs. They start to morph into more comprehensive universities, and you're seeing all the universities in Ontario follow this trend, and the undergraduates are being left behind because Laurier is now trying to be just like Western or Waterloo or the University of Toronto, which is kind of ludicrous in my opinion, that you could take a small undergraduate university and turn it into a research powerhouse in a few decades. And it's this kind of one-size-fits-all solution, at least in Ontario, that's robbing students of vocational schools, that's robbing them of smaller liberal arts style colleges where maybe tuition would be quite affordable because you don't have to pay for research laboratories and scientific equipment if all you're offering are humanities courses.
Right.
So it's that one size fits all model that's, again, at least in Ontario, that I feel like is really limiting students. And I would just like to open it up to competition. Let entrepreneurs figure out ways to educate people. Let consumers figure out respectable institutions. Let employers figure out what's a correct signal for a good hire or a good employee, and let people figure it out when it comes to how they want to educate themselves and how they want to provide education. Because just as we're all unique individuals, there's not one right way for post-secondary education to proceed. We should have multiple options: in person, online, vocational, philosophical, and everything in between. In my view, the more options, the better.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Now, when I think about your educational journey, Jordan, I've known over the years many people who started a PhD and then were done after 1 year. I mean, washed out. I know many people who were in a PhD program forever. There's a lot in the middle who were all but dissertation. They were in thesis land, and I don't know where they went in thesis land, but you never kind of saw them again, and they were never done. But then, but I talked to you, and you actually did it in 5 years. You did all the courses, the thesis, and you wrote the monster thesis too.
Yeah, I actually did it in 4 years.
Wow,
And
yeah, that's great.
I would have finished it in 3 had I not had to wait for my committee, which was, it's just the logistics of, you have an internal committee of professors from your university. So you have to, when you're finished your rough work, you have to pass it on to them and they have to read it. And then we all have to make time to get in the same room together and talk about it. And then same thing when you get to your external reviewers, you're bringing in people maybe from different universities. That includes travel. So you have to find a date. So if you sort of just subtracted that, I could have been done, because I wrote the dissertation very, very quickly.
Oh, good for
I
you.
could have been done in 3 years.
Right. Because I have a good friend of mine. What stopped him from ever completing the doctorate was that he bit off more than he can chew. He had a very grand vision for the thesis he was going to write. It's going to be bigger and more impressive than everyone else's. And as a consequence, it never got done. But you actually set out quite a goal for yourself. Why don't you talk about that a little bit? And
sure. Well, my research is and my approach to, I guess, historical scholarship is a little bit different than what most academic historians generally do. First off, the topic that I was interested in was a sport topic, which academic historians are not generally interested in. But there's a whole subgroup of historians, and they're generally housed in kinesiology or physical education departments that do deal with history. So there's a sub niche of sub-historians. But the two don't ever seem to talk to each other. They're like little cloistered off groups. And my goal in research was to connect the political and intellectual historians with the sport historians and write a dissertation in the middle. And generally when you do that in academia, you leave nobody happy. Like the sport historians don't like you because it's not about sport, and the political and intellectual historians don't like you because it's not enough political and intellectual history.
Yeah.
But I was able to thread the needle, I think, rather successfully.
The Riff Chord Podcast.